This is not a picture of me as a young man in elementary school, but I very well could have been. We have chairs like this in our library. If you want to try this after service, go ahead and go in there, and I'll hold the chair, and you can stick your head through that little hole in the end. And that seemed like a good idea at the time, and now we see the hacksaw there trying to get the little guy out, right? So think it through. Clearly not thinking. Let me see here. Think this thing through, right? I mean, that airplane is not going anywhere. What's that? Who would do that? Well, somebody who is not thinking it through would do that, right? My brother Randy is here from Denver, and I worked for Randy for years framing houses, and we didn't do anything quite this silly. I'd like to say I was unscathed, but I have some scars that are his fault. Well, no, probably my fault. But we didn't do anything quite like this. Think. As my twins all do this, right? Yeah. Okay, all right. This one, sometimes we forget to think. I don't know if you have trees that you need taken down or whatever, but don't hire this guy. That's just going to complicate everybody's life, certainly his own. Anyway, so here we see these pictures of people who did not clearly think things through. And how does that apply to what Jesus is telling us today? He is saying, listen, this thing of following me, of being my disciple, is something you need to think through. Think about the end. Think about what this is going to be like. It's not going to be an easy road. We think about Jesus as, on our passage today, he's got a following, a big crowd, we're told, following after Jesus as he walks down the road. And we're told he turns and says to them, so he's probably got a multitude of people following him. He turns to them and says, well, count the cost, right? Here's what you need to know about being a follower of mine. So let's contrast that to another time when he called his disciples. Certainly the Mark account where it's really short, right? He gets, and he says, hey, pick up your stuff and follow me. And what did they do? These fishermen, what did they do? They picked up their stuff and they followed him. Like, well, that's pretty easy, right? So why is he telling those disciples, pick up your stuff and come after me, and he's telling these, count the cost? Well, because it's an entirely different thing. When Jesus went to those young men in these outskirts of towns, these fishermen, and says, follow me, Jesus was a rabbi, and to be called to follow a rabbi was a joy for the family. Because most of these young men had come to the point in their life where it was just time to settle into the family business. Right? They'd gone through their education, they'd got to this far, and now, well, it's just time to be a fisherman. This is what you're going to be. These young teenage boys, this is where you're going to go. And all of a sudden a rabbi comes through town and says, hey, come follow me. Which was most Hebrew boys' dreams, right? Sweet. They drop everything to get the call to go on and to continue learning, being life learners, following this rabbi that we know now as the true Passover lamb. Jesus has this multitude following him in Luke. And what have we seen? We've seen healings after healings after healings all the way through. Maybe this is a good time to hit pause and say, we've just been preaching the lectionary through the summer. And as we read through Luke and as we walk through this gospel, we've seen a lot of healings. We've seen a lot of things. And all of a sudden we come to this really hard teaching that Jesus is giving to the people who are just following after him. They're following after him because he's fed the 5,000. He's fed the 4,000. He's healed people all over the place. He's fed people all over the place. Well, it's amazing how many people will follow somebody that hands them food, right? And so he's turning to them and says, you need to count the cost of what it really means to be a disciple, what it really means to follow after me. So here we find in the lectionary on Labor Day weekend, which is universally known as Skip Church weekend, right? I mean, that just is. Because Sunday school starts next week, and so everybody's like, well, and you could, our children's message, right? I mean, yeah, normally, this is true. I'm not making this stuff up, right? It's Universal Skip Sunday, and all of a sudden we have this really hard teaching about what it takes to follow Jesus. So I sort of feel like I'm preaching to the choir, right? Because the ones that really need to hear this skip church. So here we are. But maybe, just maybe, there's a nugget in here from Jesus' teaching that applies to you. So let's open our ears and let's see. And we're going to go about it this direction. I'm not questioning how Jesus taught this. Jesus was the greatest teacher who ever lived, and I'm not questioning the way he went about it. But I think the way that it makes the most sense for me to go about this is to start in the middle, then go to the end, and then we're going to conclude by going back to the top. All right? So if you're following along, that's the way we're going to go. We're going to start in the middle, starting in verse 28, as Jesus turns to the crowd, and this is what he's saying. Suppose one of you wants to build a new tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? Ralph would call that wisdom, right? I mean, how many proverbs could we point to that say, Jesus is quoting a proverb, isn't he? How many proverbs? Lots of them talk about this. Consider, begin with the end in mind, right? Saying, think this thing through. For if he lays the foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him. Now, we talk about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And you got to know that that's something I believe with my whole heart. That we need a personal relationship, that we have a relationship with the one true Passover lamb. And yet, we're not to live faith or our faith life like that. There's a public element to how we do life as disciples of Jesus Christ. Look, count the cost. Others are watching to see how you count the cost as a disciple of Jesus Christ. There's a public aspect to how we do this thing called life. And Jesus says it here, right? Consider it. Give an honest evaluation of how you are living this thing called discipleship. How are you doing it? Count the cost. Think this thing through. How's it going? Because people are watching. And people would say, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish it. And then he gives us the illustration of an honest evaluation. And the honest evaluation, or the illustration that Jesus has used is this in verse 31. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? We would say wisdom, right? Verse 32, if he's not able, he will send a delegation while the others are still a long way off, and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, any of you who does not give up everything cannot be my disciple. So Jesus tells us to count the cost, to think this thing through for us personally, but then also others are going to look around us. And then he says, be willing to surrender to the stronger king. Be willing to surrender to the one that has 20,000, the one that you can never compete with. And we'd say, well, that's kind of makes sense, right? That goes along the wisdom literature. But that's not what he's pointing to. What he's pointing to here is the gospel. What he's pointing to is you in your own power are going to try to strive and do, and you're going to consider the cost of how can I get this accomplished, and how can I get that accomplished, and how can I defeat this, and how can I defeat that? And he's saying, listen, I am the true king. I'm the stronger king. You want to know how to be a disciple of mine? You want to know how to get that peace that comes? Trust me. Jesus says, or we're told about Jesus in Philippians chapter 2, verse 10, which I should have Mary quote because it's her favorite, says, one day every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. One day, everybody, and then it goes on to say, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. So I don't know what spectrum that isn't covering, right? Everything under here, everything here, and everything up here. Everyone, one day, is going to admit and surrender to the stronger king. What he is saying, as a disciple, consider the cost and surrender right now and live for me. Why? Why does he want us to surrender? The gospel is secure, right? It's for all who believe. The gospel is secure. That doesn't change. Why does he want us to come after him and to be a disciple? Remember, the Great Commission doesn't say, go and make converts, right? It says, go and make disciples. Well, why? Because disciples make disciples. So how does he go about it, or what does he tell us? He wants us to be useful, and he tells us that in the very next verse 34. So I said we're going to start in the middle, we're going to go to the end, so this is the end. Why does he want us to be disciples? He wants us to surrender to him as the stronger king, to consider the cost of what it would have to give up, but also what we would gain. It says in verse 34, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is neither good for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears, let him hear. He wants us to be useful for the kingdom. He wants us to make a difference, right? There's a public aspect to how we go through this life. There's a public aspect of how we live, and he wants us to be useful for the kingdom, just like salt is useful. Now, to us, we say, well, we've got 99-cent salt, no big deal, right? Well, they had salt. They had wars fought over salt. The salt was a huge deal. Roman soldiers were paid by salt because salt was, it was important because it's a mineral that we all need, but it's also important because it preserves food. They didn't have refrigeration. They didn't have good tasting food, and so salt was a very, very important thing. And we don't need to go in too deep, but so much so that, they fought wars over it. Now, think about this. How many of you had the same salt in your cupboard for 2 years? Okay. As I look around, I see people who don't cook. All right. Welcome. Good to have you. Sure glad you're here. Did it lose its saltiness? It doesn't, does it? So what is he talking about? Is Jesus making this up? Does salt not lose its saltiness if Jesus in air? Well, you're going to be surprised when I say, no, Jesus isn't in air, right? They got their salt mostly from the Dead Sea, and as the water would evaporate, there would be the salt along the shores. Anybody been to the Dead Sea? Miss Elaine has, that's right. It still happens, right? I mean, you can still see how this happened. And so they would take the salt off as it evaporates, the salt would be around there, and they would grind it up as fine as they could, and that's what they would sell. Now, the difference is there's all sorts of minerals also that are in that. So there is the salty part, but then there's also rocks and dirt and whatever else minerals involved in that. So as you get a jar of salt and you shake that up real good, after a while, the salt would be in one layer. There's minerals in this layer and there's minerals in this layer. And so as you buy a jar of salt, you would get rid of the top stuff and you would use the middle stuff, but by the time you get through the middle stuff, the bottom stuff doesn't taste salty. It doesn't do any good. It's lost its saltiness. It serves no purpose but to throw out on the ground. And so when Jesus says, what good is salt without its saltiness? When it loses its saltiness, he's talking about this. Salt, after a while, is just other minerals, and it serves no purpose. It doesn't preserve food. It doesn't flavor food. It doesn't do anybody any good. And he's saying to you and me, after a while, we don't do anybody any good. Consider the cost. Be useful for the kingdom. How? Right? That's why we did it this way. Start in the middle, go to the end. Why do we need to count the cost? Why do we need to surrender to the stronger king? Because we need to be useful. He's designed us to be useful for his honor and for his glory. And how do we do that? Then we go back up to the top. Starting in verse 26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother and his children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Does that sound consistent with what we know Jesus to teach us about family? It sounds a little out there. Now, we have other times where Jesus said, well, who is my mother and who is my brothers? But the point of that time and the point of this time isn't to say, you shouldn't care about your wife and your family. It's to say that you can't hold your family above your relationship with him. That you have to be willing to give up what is most important to you. Now, as I think about this, take my relationship with Christ out of this. What is most important to me? Well, clearly it's Gina and it's my girls, right? I mean, that's not a surprise to anybody that comes here. Most important to me is my wife and my girls. That is, and Jesus isn't saying I shouldn't love Gina and I shouldn't love my kids. What he's saying here is that I need to be willing to surrender them to him. That if it causes me to not submit to him as the stronger king, then I'm wrong. Surrender even the most important things to Jesus. Now, this is get on my soapbox, preach to the choir again here. But what does that really look like? What does it really look like to surrender to the stronger king with the most important things in my life? Well, you want to know what the most important things in your life are? I can show you real quick. Wait a second. You can tell me real quick. Who wants to step up? All right? This is nice. This becomes very important to a lot of people in the summertime. Very important. So important that we'll skip anything to go to a game, to take our kids to a game, anything. Got a family reunion? Got a softball tournament. My bad. Got church? Softball. Can't do it. Want $1 million? Sorry, can't show up. Got a softball tournament. Give it to the next guy, right? Wait a second, that might be the time where that isn't true, right? And that's the point, is you want to know how you're doing and surrendering the most important things to you. For the most important thing, the king, the stronger king, look at your time. What takes your time? Look at your treasure. What takes your treasure? What are you invested in? And you guys know the third T, your talents. What do you invest your talent in? And if we answer those things, honestly, what takes my time and my talent and my treasure, I will show you what is most important to you. The thing that you have the hardest time surrendering to the stronger king. And then he goes on. Number 2, surrender ourselves. Now this is a passage that everybody will read, or when Benji read it, we've all heard it, we all know it. Take up my cross, and I'm going to just unpack it just a little bit, not a lot, because I know everybody's hungry and we got better things to do with our time than to be at church, right? Okay, my bad. All right. Benji's got to get to a softball game, so let's get going here. And anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. How many times do we hear it said, just my cross to bear? I'm going bald, right? It's just my cross to bear, oh well. I got an ingrown toenail. Just my cross to bear, a little pain. Such a misuse of that. Our cross to bear is not about hangnails, and it's not about going bald. It's not about getting wrinkles and whatever we say is our cross to bear. When Jesus says, take up your cross, you know what the cross is? The cross is life. I love our cross. You guys know that because I point to it all the time. When I come in by myself and pray, I stare at that cross with the candle flickering off of it if you get here early enough in the morning. Come on and try it out. I'll let you in, all right? It's pretty cool. Just come and you kneel. And I love our cross. And it's a beautiful cross, but the reality is that the cross was not beautiful. It was a sign of death. Jesus is the true Passover lamb that was on that cross for you and for me. And we all know that sort of theologically. But when he says, take up your cross, we kind of get this idea that we have our nice necklaces, take it up. We have nice earrings with the cross on it. Let's take up our cross. Well, what about the electric chair, right? We don't see a lot of people wearing necklaces with the electric chair on it. We don't see a lot of people wearing earrings with lethal injection syringe. Right? But that's essentially the same thing. What it's saying is, lay down your life. You're willing to give up the most important things to you? That's awesome, and that's really, really hard. Your time, your talent, and your treasure. But are you willing to give yourself? Every fiber of what you want and who you are. Lay down your life. Aren't you glad we're headed back to Romans where we can take this back up with Paul? Lay down your life as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Count the cost of being a disciple. And now I'm going to just read a quick section in closing from the most famous Lutheran pastor, certainly in our last 3 generations. I'm going to say my generation, but it's a little beyond that. Miles' generation. That wasn't funny. I was serious. But that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the cost of discipleship. And if you don't know, Dietrich was arrested because he opposed Hitler and the Nazis during World War II. And he was arrested, he was imprisoned, and a few days before the end of the war, he was executed. But we have some of his works and the things that he believed in and the things that he was ultimately willing to die for, to surrender to the stronger king, not Hitler, but the stronger King Jesus. And this is what he says. The cross is laid on every single Christian. As we embark on discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ. In union with his death, we give over our lives to death. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise good, godly, fearing, happy life. But it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man, we all know this, right? When Christ calls a man, he bids them come and die. Aren't you glad you didn't skip church this week? The challenge to consider the cost of being a disciple. Because when Christ calls us to follow him, he bids us come and die for me. Amen?